The European debt crisis. Visualized. What is the European debt crisis? It's the failure of the euro, the currency that ties together 17 European countries in an intimate but flawed manner. Over the past 3 years, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain have all teetered on the brink of financial collapse, threatening to bring down the entire continent and the rest of the world. How did it happen? Uniting Europe. For most of Europe's history, it's been at war with itself. And countries at war with each other tend to do less business together. Europe was always a continent of trade barriers, tariffs, and different currencies. Doing business across borders was difficult. You needed to pay a fee to exchange currencies. And you needed to pay a tariff fee to buy and sell to companies in other countries. That tended to stifle economic growth. Then came World War II, which devastated Europe. Because the situation was so dire, the fastest way to rebuild Europe was to begin to remove these barriers. Steel and coal tariffs came down, so that a steel mill in one country could sell to a builder in another. This gave the survivors an idea: a unified Europe, a union across the continent that would end all future wars. Countries began to band together toward this goal, bringing down trade barriers, lowering the cost of doing business. One of the last barriers to fall was the Berlin Wall. With a united Germany, Europe was ready. 27 countries signed the Maastricht Treaty and created the European Union. This made doing business across borders easier, but there was still one major obstacle: the different currencies. A decade later, they had won. The euro, launched on January 1st, 1999. Countries adopting the euro, called the euro area, discontinued their own currencies. They also discontinued their own monetary policies, giving control to the newly formed European Central Bank, commonly referred to as the ECB. The euro area now had one unified monetary policy, but it still had many different fiscal policies. A key reason for the current debt crisis. Monetary policy versus fiscal policy. You see, it's important to understand the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy controls the money supply, literally how much money there is in the economy and what the interest rates are for borrowing money. Fiscal policy controls how much money a government collects in taxes and how much it spends. The government can only spend as much as it collects in taxes. Anything above that amount, it has to borrow. This is called deficit spending. Before the euro, countries like Greece not only had to pay high interest rates to borrow, but they could only borrow so much. Lenders weren't comfortable lending them too much money. But now that they were part of the euro area's new united monetary policy, the amount they could borrow skyrocketed. Smaller countries suddenly had access to credit like never before. Greece and other countries, which previously could only borrow at rates around 18%, could now borrow for the same low rate as Germany. How? Germany's credit card. You see, joining the euro area is a lot like sharing a credit card. Germany's credit card. Lenders now believe that if Greece was unable to repay its loans, Germany and the other big economies of Europe would step in and repay them because they were now bound by a common currency. With a new abundance of cheap credit, Greece and other European countries were able to adjust their fiscal policies and increase spending to previously impossible levels. Some countries embarked on huge deficit spending programs, primarily for politicians to get elected. They made promises such as more jobs and generous pensions, all of it paid for with the new money they could now borrow. The governments of Greece, Portugal, and Italy accumulated huge debts. However, they were able to repay these debts with more borrowed money. As long as the borrowing continued, so did the spending and the unbalanced fiscal policies. In Ireland and Spain, cheap credit fueled enormous housing bubbles, just as it did in the United States. Credit flowed, debt accumulated, and the economies of Europe became tightly intertwined. Companies began opening factories and offices across Europe. German banks lending to French companies, French banks lending to Spanish companies, and so on and so forth. This made doing business incredibly efficient, while at the same time tying together the collective fate of the euro area. Things continued this way as long as credit was available, and credit was available until 2008. Spurred by a collapse in the U.S. housing market, a credit crisis swept the globe, bringing borrowing to a halt everywhere. Suddenly, the Greek economy couldn't function. It couldn't borrow money to pay for